Yeah, I think, I mean, you're a branding person too, and I always believe it's brand, market, sell. A lot of companies, whether they're big or small, are always trying to really force the sale. And then when it's not happening, gets really frustrated. And so we need to go back and really go through the brand and the marketing before we can do the sale. And I find that then the sale happens a lot faster.
Hmm.
So for me, I used to own a dance studio for about 7 years, and now I work for myself doing a lot of creative brand strategy, podcast hosting, business development, things of that nature. And I think, podcasting has been so great for three reasons. The first one, for the relationships that you build. I've always been a person that just loves talking to all sorts of people and hearing their stories. So that was just like a natural fit for me. So podcasting obviously is not the only way. There's a ton of different ways that you can showcase your brand and market, but you've got to find what works for you. So for me, it's the relationships, those one-on-one conversations I have. And for me, they're anywhere from 15 to 40 minutes. But then I talk about the after podcast. And usually that guest and I will talk for another 15 to sometimes an hour long conversation. And you really get a lot of information there. So the relationships, number one, is really important. And I always talk about really listening actively, really caring about what they have to say. And then how can you provide that person value of any kind? So that's really what started it all. And then I think the other two pieces are, number one, like you said, the content piece. So it provides an easy way to get content. You could also eventually turn it into a written piece. You could do a video like you're doing now. There's many different ways you can kind of pull from it. But it allows for consistent content, which is part of the brand strategy that a lot of businesses are missing. And it doesn't have to cost as much. Obviously, to kind of set it up, there's a little bit of a fee, but it's really about the time. And then the third piece, which I don't think a lot of people talk about, is the research that you get from doing these interviews. So like you said, I have my own podcast I've done for quite a while, and then I do a couple others. And the feedback you get to really figure out, where should my business go next? What are my people actually asking for? What's the problem here? You don't get that any other way. And I think that's really interesting, to really pull from these one-on-one conversations and create kind of this sense of research and data of where to go next.
Hmm. I really like a point that you made a couple of minutes back about small businesses, or most businesses are usually trying to push the sale
Mm-hmm.
over pushing or cultivating a relationship. And can you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe how podcast is a form of, or can be, a form of relationship marketing?
Yeah, I think for me, the one thing I am very strong on, and I've known for a long time, but podcasting just reinforces it, is that every single person on this earth wants to know they matter. They want to know they matter. They want to know that what they say has value, that they are cared for. And in a day and age now where everything is about technology and swiping left or right and messaging and doing everything so quickly without actual human interaction, it can tend to feel like nobody cares. So really building that relationship, just which seems crazy, but it's not, that there's not that many people stopping to actually listen, to actually have somebody have a moment, that alone builds a relationship, that you leave being like, wow, that person, they cared. They kind of gave me a moment. I got to talk to them. And again, you're not trying to sell anything afterwards. You're just there saying at the very end, I always say, is there anything else I can do for you? Is there anyone I can connect you with? Is there anything you're looking for? And the amount of people that have said, do you know, no one's ever asked me that,
Hmm.
is insane to me. So I think it's that. It's not about, okay, I've done this interview, now I'm going to push a sale at this moment. No. It's really the beginning of building that trust, that care. And then you follow up with the give that you said. And then it's the next thing. And then suddenly this person starts to say, wow, I like this person. They get me. What are they doing? Let me check out their LinkedIn or their website or whatever it is. And sometimes that conversation starts to happen. It doesn't always. It's definitely a longer game, but that person is going to buy from you without you having to really sell. And it's going to be someone that you can retain and refer. And it's just a better option to do that relationship building.
Oh, for sure. I think that's very much the attitude that I walked into the online trade show that is LinkedIn. Just the idea, well, if I walk in and give instead of walking in and asking, probably open a lot more doors and just have a whole lot more fun, you know. So
Yes.
I'd like to come back and we'll, in a couple of moments, I'd like to talk about maybe some insights you have for positioning a podcast and maybe building an audience, you know, whether you need one comes before the other or if you know align it afterwards, but we'll come back to that. I'd love to talk more about you now and your background. Your bio says that when you were younger you loved phone calls and so on. So what how did you get into podcasting like at all, and why do you love it so much?
Yeah, I have always been someone that, again, loves to interact with people either on the phone or in person. I'm not really a big texter. And so, I mean, that wasn't really around back then, but even now, I really like the interaction with people on the phone. And there was actually a psychologist I spoke to on my show that talked about more people, when you just listen to their voice on the phone, are actually more truthful, more honest, more real. And so you get the real version of them versus sometimes even in person or just in a written form. So I love that piece of it. But
I'm curious. Yeah.
yeah, so I grew up in like the health and fitness space, the dance space. Like I said, I owned a dance studio for about 7 years. And I started the podcast while I had the studio. And honestly, my podcast, Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, came from this idea of two things. So I had been listening to podcasts for a long time already at that point. And there were so many high level people that would tell their story and be like, well, I was broke and homeless, but now I make millions. And I remember listening and being like, what about the middle? Like
Yeah.
where most people are.
Mhm.
So there was that fascination, but there was also the fascination of like, I was just meeting so many amazing people every day that were craving that moment to have their story be told. And I just wanted to provide a platform from that. So initially, anything you do, whether it's a business or a podcast, needs to come from a passion or a frustration. It needs to come from some place internally of you as to why you're doing it. And honestly, I tell people if they want to start a podcast, like, and if you are a small business, like probably a lot of your listeners or watchers, is just, try one episode.
Mhm.
Just try a little bit, see if you even like it. Cause you may be like, I don't like this at all. I don't like this process. So don't do it. But
Mhm.
try a little bit at a time. Initially, when I was running my other business, I did it about once a week, and then it was random because I just didn't have the time. And
Mhm.
then a few years ago, I was like, wait, I really like this, and I need to commit. And so by committing to 3 days a week and making it happen no matter what,
Mhm.
that eventually led to other opportunities. Where I was working for companies that build podcasts. And then it was like another company saying, hey, like, I see this thing working. How does it work? We have a podcast. We're not really doing a lot with it. And then really coming in and saying, okay, what's the point here? Who's our niche? Who are we trying to reach? What are we trying to do? What's our strategy here? And kind of building that out. And then going through and getting the guests and leading them through conversations. And so obviously there's a lot of little pieces within there. But I think if you're a smaller company or an entrepreneur yourself, to really go into taking action first. Like just try it and see if you like it. And then
Mhm.
if you do, come back and go through the strategy. If you're a bigger company, I usually start with the strategy first because they have a brand, they've been around for a long time. So it's always that mix
Mhm.
between strategy and action and deciding which one you need to take first or at this point.
It it is a good point, and I think, um, uh, especially well, for myself, like the last couple of months in running this podcast, I walked into it wanting it to be a closed season of like I don't know 12, 14 episodes, something like that, and then take a break and rethink it and so on. And over the course of the months, been wondering, oh, why am how do I get more listeners and so on. And that's when I realized, well, my strategy going into it was not to get 100,000 downloads and whatever. It was purely for the relationship. So I think that identify your metric, like why you're starting it. If you're doing it like for content and so on, then just maybe recognize you're not going to see a landslide initially. It might be in the replays, or in turn it into this evergreen content and then just keep posting it throughout the year, and it'll accrue over time. But that's a bit of a different discussion there. So can we if somebody's starting out, what would be some insights or recommendations you'd have for positioning a podcast? It's still a growing what's it called? Not a niche, but a media type. So there aren't maybe as many, perhaps, as other kinds of media and blogs that are out there, but there's still a good number. Any ideas there?
So I think if you are, again, a smaller business or solo entrepreneur, first of all, you have to get some of the equipment. I use Libsyn for my personal one. I have a client that uses Anchor. There's a lot of different podcast hosting companies. So there are kind of some of the logistical things that you would need to get. But I would honestly ask someone, your best friend, someone in the space, someone you work with, whatever, someone that you know, and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Would you be my first guest? And practice with them. That is exactly what I did. My very first guest was a great friend of mine. And I remember doing the call with her, and I was like, I feel nervous. I was like, do you feel nervous? But we had known each other for a while, but because it was hitting record, it felt uncomfortable. And it came out good. It wasn't great. The first time you do anything is not great, but it's just testing the water. So I think it's, go through and say, what do I want to talk about? Or who do I want to interview? If you're really interested in, a certain niche of, you want marketers, but you want to talk in marketers who only do email marketing, or you're like, you know what, I really want to do a podcast about, what it's like to be a garbage man. And I'm just going to interview a bunch of them. Like, there are so many different varieties and niches that you can choose from. So kind of start with something. Don't overthink it. And then really find that person that that you can interview and test it. What did they think? Get their feedback. How did you feel about it? And just do that first one, do a few, and then you can kind of go back and say, okay, what am I trying to do here? And go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first get a little experience, see if you enjoy it, see if you're comfortable with it, because it's always a fun idea until you actually hit the ground and have to do the running.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, I am really big on doing what you like to do. Just because you're listening to this or you see someone else saying, oh, podcasts work, I think, podcasts work for me because it fits who I am as a person. I'm naturally curious. I love interacting with people. I love listening. I love chatting. That's who I am. I remember a few years ago, building an online course was a big deal. And everyone's like, you got to do it. You got to do it. Yeah. And I was doing it. And I was like, oh my God, I hate this. I was like, I hate this. I don't like this. This is not me. I got through about a quarter of it and I was like, I don't want to do this. I was like, it may work for a lot of people. It's not to say it doesn't, but it wasn't working for my personality. So that's why I think testing is really important, to not overthink it, to say, let me just interview one person. Like, did I like that process? Was that stressful? Was it uncomfortable? Do I feel alive when I do it? Do a couple of them, and then you can really get into, okay, how do I do this? How much do I want to push? Do I want to do it, like you're saying, 12 episodes a season? Do I want to do it 1 day a week, 5 days a week? You can go from there, but you've got to test and see if it's right for you and how you function first.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point, that just because it's popular, like you said, everybody is doing a course, how do I say, there are so many different kinds of people. Like, I love the whole Myers-Briggs test. So if you take that as maybe a benchmark, whatever you may think about that, there's maybe 16 kinds of people, which means there's 16 kinds of ways to do marketing, which means 16 kinds of ways to maybe cultivate relationships or how to run your business. So for one of those 16 types to stand up and say, hey, this is, everybody should be doing this. Like, well, awesome for you. I might need to figure out my own way, to get into that. So just for the listeners, don't feel pressured just to copy somebody else, but
we're both into branding, right? So like, what I love about branding is really pulling out what makes someone or a company unique, and how do we showcase that? So even in podcasting, right? You have, if you're not familiar with podcasting, Gimlet is a very different genre of podcasting. It's very highly produced. It's almost like you're listening to a television show. Most people are not going to be able to do that or want to do that. It is so much time. But it's a very different style. There's the interview style. There's someone I know that did a whole podcast for the medical industry of just, they could listen on their way to school of how to do things. Some people use it as part of a course that they do. Some people do roundtables. Even within that space alone, there's so many different ways to do it. You could do a solo episode. So there's no right or wrong. Again, it really goes back to like, what is it that you like? What are you about? What do you want to be doing? Test it. And if it doesn't fit, you can either move on, or if you have the funds, you could hire somebody else to do it if you know it's valuable, but it's just not your thing.
No, there's a good idea there as well. Hire external talent or partner with somebody if it doesn't work for you, but you know you want that
Hmm.
material. So last question for you then is for building an audience. Um, and I guess that maybe goes back to the what we were talking about with strategy, like what was your intent for the thing, out the gate. But for building an audience, what's the how do you do it? Any recommendations there?
Yeah, so I think it's something that, when you're thinking of building an audience doesn't mean that you have to have 10 million listeners, right? That's not what it's about. An audience can be 100 people. So I always tell people, don't underestimate the fact that you had 25 people listen to an episode that you've never met before.
Mhm.
That's huge. So there's a few different things. I mean, it's like anything else, you have to get the word out. I literally talk about podcasting all the time. So in conversation, I bring it up. I'll say, have you ever listened to it? Or, hey, do you know I have one? Or would you like to be a guest? So I'm constantly talking about it in everything that I do.
Mhm.
I'm posting about it on social. I really post a lot with LinkedIn and tagging different people. Your guests alone, asking them to listen and share. I always say listen and share if you like. The type of guests that I do for my personal show, some of them, they are everyday people and they're not used to having so many people listen. So they don't feel comfortable sharing, and that's okay. So no pressure, but definitely ask your people that are on, like, hey, like I send every time the email, here's all the links for everything you need to send out. Here's your picture, everything there so that they can do it is a big part of it as well.
Mhm.
And again, really finding a very specific niche. One of the podcasts that I do the strategy and co-hosting on Inside Voice for Voice Summit just got named one of the top 8 podcasts in voice tech. And I think a huge part of that is that's also a very small world right now.
Mhm.
So it's like, okay, for us, it was like, how do we find our place within that? What is everybody else doing? How can we do something a little bit different and provide value for this community? So really finding that niche is going to be another big tool for you as well.
Mhm. Yeah, because it means able to have a more focused discussion rather than just being the Dominic de Souza podcast. Like I have no idea what that's going to be about.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Don't be afraid to go small and deep. It really in my opinion, it's much better. Again, would you rather have 100 really dedicated listeners that love what you do and want to be a part of it and either want to be a part of your community or work with you? Or do you
Mhm.
want 100,000, but they listen for 5 minutes and turn it off and come in once in a while? There's value in those smaller, deeper numbers. So don't underestimate
And especially if you're doing it, you're creating it as content
that. Hmm.
to communicate your business, your values, your brands, who you're working with, then given that you're a small business, you probably don't want volume of business inquiries and so on. If it is only 25, maybe 100 people dedicated who are happy to listen, or 50 who want to listen, that's a perfect, cultivation pool for qualified leads.
It is.
Far
And,
better.
don't underestimate the people you're interviewing too.
Mhm.
One of the things when I've talked to different, brands, so bigger companies, and they're starting a podcast and we're going through strategy, and the first thing they say is, well, I only want the CMOs of the top companies in the world, Nike, Google, Amazon. And I'm like, well, of course, everybody would love that. But the reality of that happening is quite slim unless you have that connection, right? But one of
Mhm.
the things that I've learned from my own podcast and the others that I do is that the people who are not as well known, who are not as famous, they're not the names you're hearing all the time, actually bring in more listenership. And it's because they're not getting that platform. So if you
Mhm.
can provide that platform, so if you're looking at businesses, instead of doing the top person, but you get the third or fourth or the 10th, that person is so excited. Again, going back to the fact that you cared, you listened, that they matter, that their opinion has value, that they are not only going to be, excited to be a part of that interview, but they're going to share that, and they're going to share that in multiple places. And their friends and family and their coworkers are going to listen. And you
Mhm.
never know who they know. And the connections I've made just from the connections of people within my interviews,
Right.
that makes a difference. So when you're talking about listenership, it's not only about who's listening, but who's actually on my show and who do they know and what's their reach when they share
Mhm.
the episodes as well.